On the 27th of December, 1922, after multiple delays throughout the year, Hōshō was finally completed and commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy. Captain Kaizo Ryutaro, whom had been in charge of equipping Hōshō since the 13th of November 1921, was relieved by Captain Toshima Jiro, whom would be Hōshō's first active commanding officer. The Naval General Staff and Japanese designers were eagerly awaiting this day, as Hōshō was an experimental warship and many new ideas were being placed onto one ship in the first go. While the Japanese had hoped for the most efficient platform when designing the ship, now that it was able to be used, it was time to test if they were actually practical in active operation from day to day or not. On the 22nd of February 1923, the first landing trials were conducted, and the Japanese used British pilots to conduct these tests, as Japan did not yet have pilots experienced enough to land or take off from such a small platform. In early March, Hōshō would receive its first air groups, consisting of 9 Type 10 1MF fighter planes and 6 Type 13 B-1M3 torpedo bombers. These planes would also come with their own Japanese aviators, as there were finally enough experienced hands due to the British pilots having trained them. Since Hōshō now had its own aircraft and its own pilots, the ship would undergo regular testing, whether it be landing, takeoff, maneuvers, and gunnery drills. Testing would carry on until June of 1924, when results and accounts had been collected, and it was decided that the ship needed to go through a major refit, as many of the ideas placed into the initial design had in fact been very faulty. Japan had every intention of constructing a second Hōshō-type aircraft carrier. It was to be slightly larger, so it could have an increased air group, it would have an armor belt to defend it from destroyer fire, and it was also intended to have a greater speed. But, with all of the issues that popped up with Hōshō over its testing, the second ship was cancelled. By this point, the Washington Naval Treaty was also in effect, so Japan was limited on how much tonnage they could allocate towards aircraft carriers, and so rather than building a bunch of small ships, they decided to convert 2 battlecruisers into aircraft carriers, and of course this became a battlecruiser and battleship. Since Hōshō's design had not been as successful as intended, the original blueprints for the Amagi-class battlecruiser conversion was reworked, and eventually Akagi and Kaga would end up as dramatically different warships from what Hōshō was. One of the most noticeable and common complaints from Japanese pilots that had to be dealt with during the Reconstruction was the island and tripod mast. Hōshō's platform was just too small for an island, while the island itself was a genius idea. Unfortunately, it was an obstacle to Japanese pilots when taking off from the flight deck, and the structure itself was just too confined to be effective in any practical use. While the island's intended roles were to be an observation point and a fire control direction point, it was also the air operations center, and since the island was removed, this vital component of the ship's operation had to be relocated, and so now air operation commanders would have to stand on 2 exposed platforms, one on each side of the ship. Another issue that had to be addressed was the placement of the 8cm anti-aircraft guns at the stern of the ship, flanking either side of the aft elevator. In the event that Hōshō were to be attacked by a hostile aircraft, they would be leading the ship, since the ship would be moving forward, and this meant that the aft placement of the anti-aircraft guns was unfavorable to the gunners whom were trying to shoot down planes attacking the forward side of the ship. With the island having been removed, there was now a good 360-degree field of fire from the forward end of the ship. As a result, both weapons and their elevators would be moved to the forward end of the ship where the island once sat. The final alteration made to Hōshō during its 1924 refit was the reconstruction of the forward end of the flight deck, since the 5-degree slope did not help aircraft takeoff, but it rather tampered with it. The forward end of the flight deck would now have a 0-degree slope. On the 20th of August 1924, with all of these modifications having been completed, Hōshō was handed back over to the Japanese Navy, and it would conduct more testing. All of the improvements made during the refit had received positive feedback, and this feedback would be applied to the reconstruction of Akagi and Kaga. However, there was still a difficult issue to address, and this was the overall size of the ship being constrictive, and this meant that takeoff and landing operations were almost impossible to conduct simultaneously, as the Japanese were trying to do at this time frame. The aircraft were capable of taking off from Hōshō when starting their run from the forward elevator, but aircraft were struggling to stop when landing before reaching that elevator, so the threat of aircraft falling down into the elevator well, should the elevator be in a lowered position, or the aircraft colliding on deck with another aircraft while one was trying to take off, was very high. As a result, the ship was sent back to Yokosuka on the 10th of March 1925 for another refit. A small rectangular section of the flight deck was removed aft of the forward elevator, and in its place a sturdy net was installed on a hydraulic system, so in the event an aircraft was landing and could not stop in time before reaching the forward elevator, this hydraulic net could be raised in 3 seconds, and it acted as a crash barrier. The installation of this system was completed on the 2nd of July 1925, and the ship was handed back to the Navy. This was the final reconstruction Hōshō would undergo during the 1920s. It would spend the rest of the decade conducting operations by itself until it was joined by the Akagi in 1928, forming Carrier Division 1. Both ships would remain active during testing until the 1930s, when war with China erupted and they were activated for service. However, their war against China is a story for another day. So, if you have learned something new from this video, why not leave a like and a comment down below, and have a wonderful day.